we do have a history of disputed elections in this country, and some of them very much legitimately disputed elections, although election fraud has generally not been the problem. As a matter of fact, I came up with a list of 6 disputed elections and 1 kind of disputed election. Alexander Hamilton actually was one of the men that was responsible for deciding for Jefferson for the 1800 presidential election. That's what led to Alexander Hamilton getting killed in a duel with Aaron Burr. There's your first really disputed election. Thomas Jefferson was elected president. Aaron Burr was elected vice president, but in those days, you voted for president and vice president independently. Aaron Burr received just as many votes as Thomas Jefferson did, or won just as many electoral votes, and then Aaron Burr decided he ought to be president instead of vice president. That's what caused the dispute, and the dispute then went to Congress, and Alexander Hamilton was the congressional leader that said only one of these guys was running for president. And through that election to Thomas Jefferson, almost certainly the impetus for Aaron Burr killing Alexander Hamilton in a duel later. Aaron Burr then actually was eventually charged with treason for supposedly trying to overthrow the government, and that's the election of 1800. There was a 4-way presidential race that ended in John Quincy Adams and Jackson basically being the top 2 vote getters, but neither one of them won a simple majority of either the vote or the Electoral College. Adams won a plurality of the vote. In other words, he got the most votes, but he did not win a majority of the votes, and the Constitution states that you have to win a majority of the electoral votes in order to become president. And so that one ended up being challenged to the Supreme Court. Eventually, the House voted Adams as the president. Jackson protested basically that it was a stolen election, and it's what he campaigned on then the next presidential election in 1828, and that's when Jackson actually won the presidency. The next one is in 1876, and it is generally considered the most disputed presidential election of all time to this day. Even Rutherford B. Hayes won, but he was determined to be the president by a special congressional commission, not by the voters, not by the Supreme Court, not by the Constitution, but by a special congressional commission. That's one, if you really want to take a look at seriously disputed elections, that's one that everybody ought to look into a little bit. 1912, Teddy Roosevelt claimed election fraud in the Republican primaries because he only got 20% of the vote in the Republican primaries, and he thought that was ridiculous. So Roosevelt ran as a third-party candidate, the Bull Moose Party, and that's what allowed Woodrow Wilson to win the presidency as a Democrat. Since the Civil War up to 1912, the Republicans pretty much had a lock on the presidency. The Republican primaries were basically the same as a presidential election up until that point, and that allowed Woodrow Wilson to sneak in. Then that brings us to the 2000 election. It came down to 1 state. The margin was so close in the state of Florida. On the first count, Bush won the state of Florida by 537 votes. He had to win Florida to win the presidency. Gore had to win Florida to win the presidency. So Florida determined the presidential election. And when it was 537 votes, instead of conceding like he was expected to, Al Gore decided to challenge. He pushed for a constitutional recount. There was a constitutional allowance for a recount in Florida's constitution. He still lost under the recount. The first recount found more votes for Bush. It increased Bush's lead. Gore fought for another recount, and then another recount after that. And finally, by the third recount, the Bush campaign said, listen, there's got to be an end to this. The state of Florida said there's got to be an end to this. The Gore campaign sued the state of Florida to try and force yet another recount. That ended up in the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court basically said, no, it's time to end this. There have been 2 recounts. Every recount has found more votes for Bush and no more votes for Gore. That didn't keep the Democrats from again crying that it was a stolen election. Frequently, referring to George W. Bush as the president who was selected, not elected. When the Democrats started talking about Trump's stolen elections, they've done it themselves. Both sides are pretty bad about doing it. The next time, obviously, then would be the 2016 election, where Hillary Clinton's campaign, now no legal action was taken. She did concede defeat. And by the way, to his credit, Al Gore did concede defeat after the Supreme Court decision. He did say, okay, that's it. I lost the election. I'm not happy with it, but I lost the election and we need to go on as a nation. That's the thing that President Trump has never done. But the 2016 election, even though Hillary Clinton conceded the election, she tried to claim, and the Democratic Party tried to claim, that somehow Russia had thrown the election in Trump's favor. And that's a big part of what the whole Russian collusion thing that Trump was impeached for. It was nonsense. There was not a bit of truth to it. And the bad part is that it was actually based on a dossier that the Clinton campaign had paid for. So Donald Trump was accused in his impeachment of talking to the Ukrainian government and asking them to dig up dirt on Joe Biden, actually Hunter Biden, but by extension then Joe, when in fact the Clinton campaign had already paid for dirt on the Trump campaign from Russia, and none of it was true. It was all basically debunked later. The very thing that Donald Trump was accused of and impeached for was the same thing that the Democrats had already done, and Joe Biden himself had done, and admitted, not just admitted, but bragged to the press about how he had withheld $1 billion of aid to Ukraine to get them to fire the prosecutor that was investigating his son. This is all about politics, and you can't trust either party when it comes to politics. When it came to the 2020 election, Donald Trump began casting doubt months before the election even occurred, talking about how it's a rigged system. Part of the thing that made it look bad was the fact that on election night, it looked like Trump was winning. But then as more and more of the mail-in votes started being counted, the election started to turn. There was a very high percentage of mail-in votes in the 2020 election because the COVID pandemic was going on. There was a huge number of mail-in votes, and they were a huge factor in it. They immediately jumped on the conspiracy bandwagon, started talking about stolen elections. They alleged all kinds of things that there was never a single shred of evidence for. Donald Trump himself never conceded defeat. And that, in a way, has torn our country apart and still is to a certain extent. And so that, to me, is the most disappointing thing. I understand that you fight hard and you want to win, and I get that. But if there comes a time to admit defeat, and all of our politicians need to do that because it's important to the country to be able to move on.